Hello, psychology students. Welcome back. We are now on lecture number 3. So, we're going to talk today about psychology and science. We want to look at what some of the approaches are in order to gather research in psychology. How do researchers in psychology study a question? Right? So, we're going to talk about some different techniques of approaching that. First technique we're going to talk about is a survey. Now, a survey, you've probably taken some of these in a magazine, or maybe when the malls were open, people you're walking through, people are taking have questionnaires they want you to answer. What is a survey? Well, a survey is obtaining information by asking a lot of individuals, either again through a magazine or by telephone or whatever. And a survey has some advantages to it. It enables you to study a large amount of data and people in a fairly short period of time. So that large volume of people can be done pretty quickly, such as the political polls you see. That's a survey where they call up 1,000 people, and based on the answers of those 1,000 random people, they come to some conclusions. So that would be a survey type of thing. It can identify large group issues and problems, and it can evaluate sometimes treatment programs, large treatment programs. Those are some of the advantages. So what are the disadvantages of a survey? Why don't we just use surveys all the time? It sounds like an easy way to do it. Well, there are several disadvantages to the surveys. First of all, many times people misunderstand the question they're being asked or don't take the right angle on it, and they will not ask for clarification, they just answer it anyway. We know that whoever asked the question, that is to say the gender of the person or their level of attractiveness, can sometimes influence the answer in one way or another. And that can go across the board. It can be ethnicity, it can be race, it can be gender. All those things potentially can influence an answer, which is not a desirable thing. Also, we found that over time that in a survey, people may not answer truthfully. They tend to have a bias toward wanting to answer in the right way. So they don't give what the honest answer is. They give instead what they perceive to be the right answer. And sometimes this is not a truthful venture either. So while surveys can be useful in a broad spectrum type of approach for research purposes, it doesn't answer a lot of the questions that we need. It creates too many issues of bias. Second thing that we're going to be looking at is the case study. Case study is something that is an in-depth analysis of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, experiences, behaviors, or problems of a single individual. A case study is a really in-depth look at something, and that can be good sometimes. We want to drill down and see what worked or didn't work in a particular case. Sigmund Freud used case studies in most of his observations. Most of his studies back in the 1800s were actually done via the case study mode. Again, this made for some good stories and good in-depth looks at individual treatment. The problem is that it became a specific disadvantage in trying to replicate any of the stuff that Freud has done. Because if you use the case study technique, you're not using a standardized approach that can be replicated, that is considered reliable, that can be done over and over again. Each individual is different, and so it's hard to recreate the conditions that exist in one person's life into another person's life. So that's a problem. So case studies tend to be anecdotal as a disadvantage. What's an anecdote? Well, that's a story. That's an individual person's experience, and it's dangerous to draw conclusions about the general population from something that's anecdotal. For instance, Maybe I go to a new restaurant on a Friday night and I tell my friend, wow, it was hopping, the food was great, a lot of some music, etc., and I give it a rave review. He then is off on Mondays. He goes on Monday night. It's a substitute chef. There's nobody there. The food is mushy. And he says, my experience was bad. And so he's going to conclude something very different than I am about the restaurant. So, but using that as evidence for the general population is a dangerous precedent. It creates issues of error bias, and again, from a research purpose, you're really not able to replicate the case study in the same way, and so that becomes a problem. So, what do we do about that? Well, we probably are going to do an experiment, right? Because that's the majority of things that are done within psychology is do an experiment. What do we deem an experiment? Well, an experiment is a method for identifying cause and effect relationships. You follow a set of rules and guidelines that we call the scientific method, and this approach will minimize bias, the possibility of error and bias, and also chance occurrences. So if you plan it properly, if you set it up in the right way, and use an experiment, you will get something that is laid out in the right way, that passes the test of science, and most importantly can be replicated or done over again with a slightly different twist or in the same sort of way, so that we can verify the information that came out of a particular study. This allows us to state that a study is reliable. Reliability in a study comes from the idea that you can replicate it and that you can prove that the data comes about over and over and over again when you try the experiment again. This is very important in establishing new foundation principles for psychology. There are a couple of different settings that you can choose for psychological research. One is a naturalistic setting. Naturalistic setting is a relatively normalized environment, and there the researchers gather information by observing individuals and their behaviors, and they don't really attempt to control the situation too much. The advantage of this is that you get more real-life behaviors. Of course, the disadvantage is that it's an uncontrolled environment. When it's an uncontrolled environment, it's difficult to really identify which thing causes what, which thing in the environment causes what behavior. And this leads to something we call confounding variables. Confounding variables affect our conclusions and make it harder to generalize our data. A confounding variable comes about when you have multiple factors that can lead to a conclusion. That's the simplest way of putting it. As a for instance, let's say you're doing an observation at a playground because you want to look at kids' behavior. So you go to observe kids, but there are a number of things that are not within your control in a playground. One of them would be the weather, right? Is it warm out or cool out? Are kids wearing jackets or are they wearing shorts and t-shirts? Does the slide get hot because the sun's hot? Is it right before lunch or right after lunch? Are there a lot of kids in the play area or a few amount of kids? All of those things are going to influence your observation, but you don't have any control about them. So then when you try to make conclusions about observing a kid's behavior, you're going to have to account for a lot of these variables in some fashion. We can do that to some degree, but not 100%. As a for instance, if you wanted to say, well, the time of day is important, in order to account for that, you'd have to make observations in the morning, at lunchtime, and in the afternoon, so that you could cover sort of the entire range of hours that the playground would be open. So that's a naturalistic research setting. A laboratory setting is a different type of setting. It involves studying individuals under systematic and controlled conditions. Many of the real-world issues are eliminated by this, and that can be a good thing. It's a big advantage because we have so much more control over the environment, Now you can start to eliminate your confounding variables. You can say, I'm keeping the room the same temperature. You can say you're going to set it up for the same time of day, your experiment. You can say you're going to limit the amount of kids that you allow into the laboratory. So there's so much more control over the environment. And because you have that much more control over what's going on, you're then able to much better eliminate some of the confounding variables. This makes your research so much more solid. You can generalize your results so much with much better validity to other populations. So what's the problem? Why don't we do all research that way? Well, if the environment is too controlled, then are you getting real life behavior? Or are people behaving in a certain way because it's a laboratory setting? So I guess there's not an easy answer to exactly how when you do research. You should use a naturalistic setting, should use a laboratory setting, and most times studies that are really good and important studies kind of use both. They start out in one setting and they say, "Let me verify my findings by going into a different setting." So that's the answer to that. Okay, so let's talk about the scientific method a little bit. Let's assume that you were doing an experiment and you were the person in charge of a research laboratory. So, first of all, let's look at what is the scientific method. The scientific method is an approach to gathering information. Uh, this allows you to answer questions, and because it's organized in a very specific way, it gives you a couple of advantages. Error and bias are minimized, right? So that your study is a better quality study due to certain steps. And in the end, your data is going to be, you're going to be able to replicate the experiment because you followed certain guidelines, and hopefully that makes your data more generalizable to other populations. So let's talk about the 6 steps of the scientific method. Right. So the first thing you want to do if you're using the scientific method in order to formulate a research study, you want to review the literature. Okay, what has already been done on your subject that you're looking at? What has already been published? And so you do sort of a background research on what's been done on your subject you're studying. And most subjects have a study that's already been done related to something that you're looking at, right? And this allows you to springboard to the next question that's involved in that study. Much of the research we see in psychology comes from previous studies, so that a lot of times in the conclusions of the study, you'll get somebody saying, well, this was an interesting finding, but if you change the situation to the next type of condition, what would happen? And that is picked up by a researcher, and they then create a different study off of that question. So that's step number 1. Number 2, you want to formulate a hypothesis and state it in a very precise way. The hypothesis, what is that? It's an educated guess about the outcome of your experiment. So you might say something to the effect of, I would like to, my hypothesis is going to be that if I give a population of angry young juvenile offenders an anger management course, I will be able to lower their level of anger in general. I will be able to help enhance their coping skills and lower their level of anger. So you state the hypothesis up front, and it's an educated guess about what the outcome of the experiment is going to be. Third step of the scientific method, you have to design the study. You select the research method, whether you're doing a naturalistic or a laboratory, and then you design your study. Much of the time, your study involves both an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is the group that's going to receive your intervention. Okay? The control group in a study is the one that receives no intervention. It's just a point of comparison, right? So it's a group of people that are going to be maybe given a pre-test and a post-test, but usually nothing in between in the control group. The third group that you might consider for your experiment is called a placebo group. Not all studies have a placebo group, but many times we do see one. In the anger management study I referred to, we did include a placebo group. Placebo is put there to make sure that it's not just the idea that you think something's going to change that makes it change. A good example would be if they're doing a study on medication and they give you a sugar pill. A sugar pill that's not going to hurt you or help you, it's just going to make you think you're taking medication. When you do that, many times there's a percentage of people that will say they do feel a little better just because they believe that the pill is going to be helping them. That's a placebo. In the study with anger management, we did use a placebo group, and so I'll explain to you how that happened. We set up three groups of 30 juvenile offenders. One group was the control group that received no intervention, just a pre and post test about anger level. One group was the experimental group. There we put 30 juvenile offenders into the experimental group, and over an 8-week period we gave them a 1-hour course by taking them out of their residence and putting them into a specialized area 1 hour a week for 8 weeks to give them the anger management course. And then there was the placebo group. The placebo group, we showed sports entertainment movies for the same amount of time. We took them out of their residence, we showed them movies, and this way we accounted for the fact that we were giving them some special attention, but just not the anger management course. So how do you begin to then design your research study and perform it? Well, after forming the hypothesis, which in the case of our anger management study, we hypothesized that if we would give them an anger management program, that their anger levels would go down, right? So then you have to go about and identify the variables. There are two major variables that you should know about that have to be identified within any study. The first one is an independent variable, abbreviated as the IV. This variable is the variable which the experimenter manipulates. That's the independent variable is manipulated. Then there is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the one that is measured by the experimenter. The dependent variable is measured. And that's also abbreviated DV. So you got the IV, which is the manipulated variable, and the DV, which is the measured variable. So it was pretty easy for us. The independent variable in our anger management study was the fact that we were giving them the anger control course, and we hypothesized that when we measured their anger level, that's the dependent variable, the measurement of the anger level, that it would go down because they had taken the anger management course. So that was our proposal. The next thing that you need to do is choose your subjects in an experiment. Choosing your subjects must be done using something called random selection. Why is that? Well, because people in the early days were biasing their studies by putting the most intelligent or the most functional people into their experimental group. That way, when they were compared to a control group that was lower functioning, it looked like the study was a great success. So we now developed this technique called random selection. Random selection is pretty easy. It's actually just eeny, meeny, miny, mo, right? So you have a pile of applicants to a study, and you just take the first person off the pile, and that goes into the experimental. The second one goes into the control group. Third one goes into the placebo group. And you keep going through the pile like that. Random assignment is just what it sounds like. Everybody has an equal chance of being in any of the groups, either experimental, control, or placebo. The chance is equal. After assigning the subjects to a particular group, then you want to do the manipulation, right? So at that point, we then assign the people to the different groups. The people in the anger management study, the control group got all the groups actually got a pretest. The pretest was a scale that measured the level of anger that they had. After the pretest, then things were different, right? The control group got nothing. They were just going to be measured before and after. The placebo group got the sports entertainment films for 8 weeks, an hour a week, coming out of their residential place. And then the experimental group ended up getting the anger management course over an 8-week period, once a week, out of their cottage. After this is done, then we have to measure what happened regarding the experiment. Okay, so in the end, we look at the measurements, the statistics by giving all of the groups a post test, right? So the all of the groups get the same anger scale that they were given in the pre-test that started before the experiment. What would you expect? Well, you would of course expect that the people in the anger management or the experimental group would be able to have the lowest level of anger. That would prove our hypothesis. However, I want to point out that if the placebo group also had an extremely lower level of anger, then you couldn't conclude that it was your anger management course. You would say it's just taking them out of their setting and showing them special attention for an hour a week for 8 weeks. Well, luckily, the next part is the analysis of the data, right? And in our case with the anger management study, when we analyzed the data, we got exactly what we thought we would get. We got about a 50% reduction in the anger level according to the scale from the experimental group. The control group showed no change, which you would expect because they didn't get any intervention. And the placebo group did show a little bit of a drop in anger levels, but not nearly as much as the experimental group, right? And that's because they did get a little special attention, but in the end, it really wasn't enough for them to get a profound effect. So, in our case, the conclusion was that our study was very effective because the level of anger dropped the most by far in the experimental group. And P.S., we were able to write a book from that study, and it was used as an anger management technique for many years in that population. So when you analyze the statistics, you look to see whether or not your study verified or didn't verify what your hypothesis was. And then you are going to report your findings and submit them to a psychological journal and publish something. I've had several publications, and that's the goal of most researchers, is to get a publication. And that's our week 3 lesson. I hope you're staying on the book out there. See you in a week.